We're going to kick this afternoon off with a series of panels that should, I think, will generate some really good conversation. As I mentioned in our fireside chat, there's a couple things that I think were the most critical things that the Space Force has accomplished in its early days. One is the quality of people that we're attracting. I will tell you, there's more people knocking on the door wanting to come in the Space Force than we can take. Not that we were bad in the past, but the quality that we're attracting has gone through the roof. And so we're going to talk about people on this next panel and talk about partnerships. Space is a global domain. It requires partnerships, both international partners, partnerships within government, partnerships with industry, partnerships with Congress, as you heard earlier today, the importance of that relationship. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Major General Kim Crider, who's going to be the moderator, if you will, for this panel coming up focused on people and partnerships.
Thank you, General Raymond, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming back from lunch. Wow, what a great morning it's been. I'll tell you what, the stories that we heard this morning were absolutely incredible. You know, I was on the ground floor when the Space Force was established, and I didn't know any of that stuff, which is probably a good thing, because those of us that were out in Colorado, we were all head down, just trying to figure out how to do day-to-day mission while all of this newness was going on, and we were getting ready to get this thing started. But it really was such an enjoyable morning and such an interesting set of discussions. And then having the chief here to tell us about how far we've come, all of the things that they've been focused on for the last 5 years, and where we are yet to go. I think this sets the stage for a lot of rich discussion this afternoon. So we got a fantastic panel that are joining us here today, and we're going to look a little bit more deeply to the force and the evolution at hand. And really, how is the Space Force fueling itself? I mean, that's really the title that we're talking about here, fueling the force with people and the partnerships it needs to meet the challenges of the threats that we see, great power competition. We hear a lot about that today and in the years ahead as we move forward. So to help me get after this topic today, please join me in welcoming to our panel Kristina Belcourt, professional staff member of Senate Armed Services Committee. Derek Tournear, a good friend of mine, the director of the Space Development Agency. Air Marshal Paul Godfrey. Goddard, thank you so much. The Assistant Chief of Space Operations for Future Concepts and Partnerships, United States Space Force. And my good friend, Kelley. Thank you for joining me, Kate. Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Human Capital at the United States Space Force, the S1. All right, so let's get into it. We have a lot of really diverse perspectives here today to help us really get after this topic of people and partnerships and how that's fueling the force. And I'm gonna start with you, Air Marshal Godfrey, because we heard a little about this from the CSO just a little while ago when he was here on the stage with General Raymond. This whole idea of the decision to embed a senior officer into the headquarters Space Force staff. You are the first foreign exchange officer that really is now established as an assistant chief of space operations from an allied nation. So in that role, help us understand from your perspective, how would you describe these first 6 months in the seat and the impact that this new role is making on the force?
I'd probably let my boss discuss the impact of this particular role. I would like to say, firstly, to carry in the team at CSIS, thank you for it was just a fascinating morning. There's something symbolic about being behind the velvet rope here. It's what it feels like as being on the staff as a 3-star officer, and proudly wearing the staff badge. I know JB from the British Embassy is here, and he's probably taking notes, saying illegally wearing badges on uniform and sending it back to the UK. But it is genuinely a real privilege. Having been, I was worried when Chairman Rogers mentioned about fighter pilots this morning, because as an ex-fighter pilot, I wondered where he was going with that. But actually, I'd done 3 tours of acquisition through my time, and I would, there's an operator part of me, but actually I'd say I was an integrator more than anything. If you look at my bio, integrating F-35s onto carriers, F-35s into the broader Royal Air Force on early Typhoon squadrons, integrating those sorts of things. And that's the way that I see myself in this particular role. I've said I could do anything in this role, the remit that General Saltzman has given me, but we've kind of settled on 3 areas, me and the very small team that we've got, and the first one is shaping futures. I know there was a conversation earlier with CSO about Futures Command. Clearly, I am not the individual standing up Futures Command, but what I can do is look and see how Futures Command fits into the organization. As General Saltzman mentioned, where are the touch points with allies and partners through the Concepts Technology Center, through the SWAC, and through the wargaming areas? And then how does that then fit into the CISRO area, the S5, the S8? And how do those conversations then become an architected, integrated force of the future that has allies and partners, as General Saltzman mentioned, integrated from the very beginning? It's not a conversation after the fact. And as part of that sort of shaping the future as well, I am leading the charge for an international partnership strategy that hopefully will hit the streets at some point in the next year. But that's fascinating because, General Saltzman has mentioned before, 5 years in for the Space Force, it is an awful lot about writing things down and understanding how we get to repeatable processes. And this is how do we get to the repeatable process of bringing allies and partners in from the beginning. There's another 2 areas that we're looking at. One is harnessing CSPO, the Combined Space Operations Forum. The primary space collaboration forum, I think 10 nations, the Five Eyes plus France, Germany, Italy, Norway, and Japan. We just had 2 weeks ago the Principals Board in Florence, and it is about harnessing the power of that forum of 10 nations, especially as those 10 nations all have either stood up space commands or, in New Zealand's case, a space squadron in the last 3 years. So now is the right time to be having those conversations to what are the partners developing, and then how can they add to the big US machine, and how can the big US machine bring in and create, as was mentioned earlier, a sort of demand signal for the allies and partners as well. So that's a really exciting area. And the third one, again, General Saltzman mentioned it. We were in the room yesterday with the new commander of SACTI, 4-star French admiral. We had a visit to NATO on the 31st of October. General Saltzman spoke at the NATO Military Committee, and that area is engaging NATO. Now, that's not telling NATO what to do by any stretch of the imagination. It's listening to NATO, understanding where they want to go, and frankly, having conversations about what it means to have space command and control, what it means to have space capability, what it means to bring, in this particular case, 32 nations together in order to maximize the deterrent effect, because ultimately, this is all about deterrence. Impact, probably, if I was to talk about impact, it's, General Saltzman alluded to it, it's being in a room and people having to change the conversation. Because where that might have been no foreign previously, if I'm in that room representing or being the action officer for US Space Force, then it has to be a conversation that involves information sharing. And so I hope there's an impact of changing that conversation so that there is more of a allied by design, international by design right from the beginning.
Yeah, so important and so valuable. So thank you for leading that charge and growing that international partner impact and influence throughout the force. In the stand-up of Futures Command as that's being planned out at the CSPO, as you mentioned, and certainly with NATO. Kate, in addition to building international partner contributions and participation in the force, we have certainly seen the build-out of just the workforce, the guardians, both military and civilian. And as General Saltzman mentioned, the Space Force has tripled in size in the past 3 years, and you have been right in the middle of that, just really driving that. So as the service continues to grow its end strengths, what are some of the major personnel initiatives that you have underway to build, manage, and develop the force to meet the future challenges?
Thanks for the question, and thank you very much for your attention here today and inviting us to continue the conversation at the 50-year birthday. This is a great forum, and Kim, thanks for the invite to be here as well as the CSIS team. You know, I think the interesting part about the Space Force right now is the maturation of, to Air Marshal Godfrey's great point, the maturation of repeatable process and making sure that our presence as a service is not just integrated inside of the Department of Defense, but that we're able to then connect and partner with external agencies as well. And so a lot of the things that we're thinking about in the human capital enterprise intersect with that theme. So a couple of things that are interesting of note, we've taken a little bit of a different approach with how we're thinking about traditional aspects of military service. Most of us who've been on active duty at one point or another in their career, you know, you think about the physical attributes of being a Department of Defense military entity, and we're thinking about it a little bit differently. We have watches on our Guardians today that are taking a different approach to physical fitness, making a awareness and a cognizance of your holistic health throughout the life cycle of a 24-hour clock, as opposed to, for example, one time a year taking a PT test. And part of this is because we're thinking about the talent that we're trying to attract into the Space Force. We're trying to attract that younger generation, highly technically competent and savvy, and we need to put them into an enterprise that actually feels relevant to their way of life and how they live, and more importantly, how they've grown up. I think those of us who have been in the military for many years know that there's a little bit of a gap between the legacy experience and the future experience, and that's a lot of what the Space Force is trying to bridge right now. Some of the other pieces you've heard a little bit about this morning if you've listened to the conversations, and probably the most groundbreaking for the service writ large is the Personnel Management Act. And thanks to the support of Congress and to many people who are quite frankly in this room today, we were able to advocate for and receive that groundbreaking legislation, which fundamentally allows full and part-time service within the Space Force, absent separate components as we know them in more historic construct. It really is a game changer. Right? It is designed to eliminate those firewalls between service, and really also designed to allow us to partner and tap into things like academia and things like the private sector to the point of relevance and speed. And I think you heard a little bit about that this morning as well. The amount of agility that is happening in the space domain today, both from a technical perspective as well as a people perspective, is tremendous. And what we're trying to do with the human capital enterprise and the Space Force is bridge those things together so that you're not just delivering technology and you've got a legacy force. You're bringing both together and to bear on the same problem. Part of that is we've got to tap into the best and the brightest. We've got to have ways to attract and retain, and we've got to have ways to know how to reach out and tap into ecosystems that may have better relevance than we might have. And I think that's a lot of where we are at the moment. So I'm very excited to be here. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that as the panel goes on.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. Derek, let's shift a little bit to what's going on at the Space Development Agency in this regard. You're moving fast.
Semper Sidious.
Semper Sidious. And in doing so, I'm sure that, the point that Kate was just making about, the need to be able to develop and deliver technology to meet the need, but have the workforce to help you do that. Has that been a challenge for you, and how are you trying to get after that?
Yeah, it certainly is a challenge. But before we get started on that, I have to say, the only reason we're successful is because they've got the best boss in the world. So, that's worked out great. So you always got to say that when your boss is in the room. But,
front and center.
Yeah. Beyond that, also we have had a good partnership with the Hill to essentially recognize that what we're doing at the Space Development Agency is essentially, in fact, General Gutlein used this at the Reagan Forum, and I love it. We are essentially the canary in the coal mine for the Space Force at large. So what we're doing with trying to go extremely quickly and do things differently as the constructive disruptor is setting the stage for what the Space Force at large will be able to adopt and promulgate through the service. And Congress has recognized that, and Congress has given us a lot of authorities and basically a lot of rope to run with to say, okay, let's see that this can really work. Now, why is that important? You know, we are pushing a lot of the limits when it comes to building and fielding and operating hundreds of satellites every other year, much more quickly than we've done in the past. And I point out, you know, in 2019 and even in 2020, before the Space Force was established, there was a lot of reticence to accept this proliferated concept. Now I think people understand that. And so now the push is, okay, now there's still reticence in accepting this spiral process where you go quickly, you go quickly, you go quickly. But I think people are starting to understand that and push that. So what enables that? If you look at that, obviously technology is part of that. Technology is a big deal. Technology's been pushed by the commercial industry to make that go more quickly. But as we started out, the Space Development Agency started out as a new agency, but we weren't able to create new program managers, new chief engineers out of whole cloth, right? We had to take those people that largely existed within the US government already, or at least in the contractor base that had been working in these large aerospace and defense type firms before. So if you look at that mentality, that entire mentality is different. You know, the concept of better is the enemy of good enough to get things launched quickly and to proliferate these constellations is not what people learn in traditional aerospace and defense. You learn better is better than good enough. And let's just continue, you know, an engineer likes to engineer, let's get the best solution out there and continue to push forward. So what does that mean when it comes to personnel and how you pull all this together? That means for us to be able to push things forward, we not only need to push industry, see some industry partners out here that are working with us, push them to think differently and go quickly, but also internally, we need to bring people into SDA and have them come in with a different mindset that's not the traditional aerospace and defense. And that's difficult to do. It's difficult to do because you're stuck in a pool where these people have, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's kind of how they grew up. So we have been incentivized, because we want to do things differently, to reach outside of traditional US government program managers and bring people in, primarily from industry, especially in the new space industry, and pull them in so they can help teach that culture of what it means to go fast, what it means better is the enemy of good enough, and really how to react to that. Historically, there's been a lot of constraints on how to hire people in to do that. Congress has been very good in giving us authorities to basically hire people in a way that we can bring them in very quickly and we can have special authorities so that we can start to shift that culture. So I'll say it's that mentality, the ability to have the authorities not only to do the acquisition quickly, but also bring new entrants, even from the personnel side, into the government contracting world to bring that new viewpoint. That's what allows us to push quickly. That's what's going to allow us to stay ahead of China, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
Outstanding. And what about international partnerships? Do you see a role for international partners in what you're trying to do? Do they play a role today?
So absolutely. So you want to talk about allied by design, right? So allied by design. So SDA's first focus was let's proliferate Link 16 connectivity around the world. The question is, why would you do that? You know, why? Look, Link 16 has been around since the 80s. Why would you want to start with something that's old? And the idea is, well, Link 16 has been modernized since the 80s. You know, it's not the same. It's not your great-grandfather's radio. But more importantly, Link 16 is what is already fielded amongst all of the services. You don't have to buy new radios. It's already fielded amongst all of our allies. We train on that. We know how to talk to that. We know how to fight in a combined allied manner with Link 16. So let's not try to force anyone into doing things differently that they're already doing on the ground. Let's force ourselves to think differently in the space community so that we can make sure that we move quickly, because we don't want to have to force the terrestrial warfighters to move quickly, because there's just a lot more mass. It should move more slowly. And because of that, we were always allied by design. Everything we have is releasable to our partners. Everything we have is transferred over Link 16, which our allies use. So we essentially don't have, nothing we have is no foreign. Everything we have is open and working with our partners.
Just on that particular point, if I may, he won't remember, but Derek was the first person. It was me and Half Smith met. It was during COVID. We got a special dispensation to come over to the US. I remember getting the briefing from Derek as to what you were doing and how quickly you were going. And as we walked out the room, Harv and I looked at each other and went, how do you compete with that? How do we get on board with that? But as just watching you from afar or across the pond and then obviously working with you in this particular job, it is amazing how it is the little things that enhance the international partnership side of things. So just, for example, publishing your standards that you're using for laser optical links, as an example, that allows everyone to get on board. Because one of the things, I talked about integration, PLEO is one of these massive areas where there's thousands and thousands and thousands of satellites, several different vendors, and if we end up in some particular vendor lock, if you like, on a particular optical link or whatever, then we're probably losing. We're going to start needing translated sats, those sorts of things. So I would massively and publicly commend you for what you have done in terms of allowing international partners to just try and hang on, water ski behind as you sort of move at speed and do what you do. And I think this is going to be huge for the future, and I think is a template of how we could do this.
Yeah. Yeah, see, it's the little things, and it's having somebody like yourself on the staff that can really help point out the little things that have such a great impact and can help sort of knit those partnerships together in a much more meaningful way. I think that's a great example to pick up on, but certainly reinforces, the importance of the role that you play, Godders. And speaking of the little things that have a great impact, so Kristina, you are one of those amazing professional staff members, like the ones that we heard about this morning, Steve Kate and others who, just working behind the scenes, helping to make sure that the right information gets to the right decision maker to be voted on and things can happen, right? And Derek mentioned authorities and different ways in which you and others in Congress are really trying to help bring forward what's needed to move the Space Force forward. Help us understand what's going on now. What's top of mind at the SASC when it comes to people and partnerships and the future of the Space Force?
Sure. First, thank you very much for having me here and for bringing a simple professional staffer up to be part of the conversation. I'm here because of that role, but I'm not here on behalf of the SASC, so I should say that these are my opinions and not necessarily those of the people that I work with on the committee or Senator Wicker or anybody else. All that said, I think that when I look at Space Force people, partnerships, the first partnership I think of course, is the one with Congress, because I was in the executive branch for a very long time, came over, stopped in industry temporarily, came over to the Hill, and all three of those are essential partners to doing any of the things that you've heard about all day long. So that's first top of mind. But then when I look at the pivot to great power competition, one, great power competition is not new, and it's always been global. As my British colleague up here knows, they've been doing that since the 18th century, right? 7 Years' War, you had the Great Game with Russia. All of those are very global. I'm a history major, not an engineer, just so I have to bring a little bit up here. A little farther back than 5 years. But those things have always been global, and a global force is something that space professionals know inherently. A global force, again, requires partners and allies to be able to do the things that you need to do. To your point on Link 16, good thing we have some Australian allies that are willing to help us out with that, right?
Yeah.
Like, because we can't get out of our own way bureaucratically in the good U.S. of America, right? So those things are incredibly important. Sometimes you need a ground station in the correct location. Sometimes you need a launch facility in the correct location. And I think that our industrial partnerships and our allies are the thing that makes that America has better than any of our adversaries by a huge margin. Another thing too, it will be more important than ever, and I'm going to echo several of the folks that have talked already today, to have space experts in all these conversations. Not just in high-level conversations in the Pentagon, you need them around the mission planning table. In the Air Force, you need them talking to soldiers and sailors and airmen, Marines that can tell you pragmatically, hey, that lightning bolt on that slide is not a real thing. This is what space can actually do for you. And absent that, you're not going to have well-informed requirements. You're not going to have well-informed operational plans and concepts. So I applaud what you are doing, especially with the Space Force Personnel Management Act. I'm glad that my colleagues, that wasn't directly mine, but I'm glad my colleagues were able to help with that. Knowing the total force has always been able to bring in those experts to the military, but I think that the voice not only needs to be within the Space Force and among Guardians, it needs to be among the Joint Force. So I know that inevitably you'll bring in some Army and Navy and Marine Corps guys to Space Force PME courses. I think that that's a really good thing to take that expertise back out to the Joint Force, but room to grow there. I think it's going to be more and more important as we go, and especially to have people that have deep knowledge of the programs and of the acquisition that can speak smartly in the requirements conversations with the Joint Force. I worry especially about the Air Force having given up all of their space expertise to the Space Force, and sometimes maybe not having the exact right perspective on what space can bring to some of those things. But I think with everything still being within the DAF, I think we're getting there. I'm looking for close ties in those areas. So thank you very much for the question.
That's really great. No, it's so important, again, to be helping to drive all of these changes, from your vantage point, and to make sure that the right information is put forward. You did mention PME and integrating with the other services and academic partnerships. I'm going to go back to you, Kate. Academic partnerships are such an important part to fueling the force. And given that the Space Force is a much smaller, much more technical force, we've seen the growth of this very unique program, the University Partnership Program. It was really just a thought when the Space Force got started. But it's really come a long way. Can you tell us about UPP and how it's evolved?
Absolutely. It's a point of pride at the moment in terms of where it started and where we are today. But before I get there, I just want to acknowledge, Kristina, your excellent point about making sure that the Space Force is not only present at the right formal meeting, but that we are informing the other services about what the space capabilities are. And I think that's so critical from an academic perspective through professional military education, but also I think what you heard earlier this morning as well, which is actually growing the service enough in order to create the right level of competence and to put that right competent guardian into that joint community, right? So that's a huge push for us going forward, and I think you're completely onto the right point there. And of course, the support that we got from the Hill to get our PME off the ground, if you will, which is, for those of you who don't know, a different approach because it combines an academic institution, in this case, Johns Hopkins, and it pulls the joint curriculum from what the DoD already teaches and combines it with the Johns Hopkins program just down the road at SAIS, and it actually combines those two into an accreditation that's pretty unique. The Guardians and the other service members who do come and participate walk away with an accredited full degree as well as their JPME credential. So it's a really groundbreaking step forward for the Space Force. We're very excited about that. The University Partnership Program that we stood up is designed to tap into an ecosystem of academic universities who really have an expertise in the space disciplines that the Space Force is focused on. And it's also designed to allow us some feeder pipelines for talent to then expose students to the opportunities that the Space Force can present, both through employment as well as us exporting back into their ecosystem in terms of getting accredited degrees and expertise themselves. So the UPP is a network of schools that we have many people who are interested in joining, and we're trying to make sure that we grow that in a measured way and don't kind of rush too far into it until we know exactly what the payback will be. But there's some really, really great examples so far. So ROTC experience and then exporting back into the service. We're also looking at how we build a similar program using some authorities that Congress gave to the Department of Defense level, whereby you attract a potential civilian employee who is still in school, who comes and does a summer rotation, much like what I did on ROTC years ago. They then come back, finish their degree, and then join the Space Force as a government civilian. So we're using the partnership program in a number of ways, as well as putting guardians into those schools for advanced degrees, masters, and PhDs. There's a lot to it, and it'll continue to grow. It's going to be a very significant tenet of that talent management and development plan that we talked about earlier.
Can I add something to what you're saying? I think that those programs are very important in showing the American people what is important about space and important about the Space Force and important about Guardians, and moving it from, I've never met anyone in the Space Force, is that really even a thing?
Is it a thing?
To, oh, I went to college with a bunch of people that joined the Space Force, or at least, you know, hey, I want to take this class. That'll be an interesting add to my history degree.
You're completely right. In fact, one of the Achilles heels that I think we acknowledge in the Space Force today is just the general cognizance of the American public about what the Space Force is, what it does, and that it exists. And so we have got to continue to beat that drum and make sure that we expose as many of our guardians to that ecosystem as we can.
Yeah.
Just a point, if I may, on that one. It's easy when you talk about international partnerships to go straight to hard capability and start talking about satellites in orbit. But it is the training and education that is the bedrock of this. And any emerging space nation out there, I mentioned 10 CSPO nations, there's 32 in NATO, and there's, because of how accessible space is now, there's many in NATO that want space programs. The first thing you need to do is train your space cadre. So again, all of the allies have looked on to see how specifically the US Space Force has been doing this. Clearly there is a long history of it, and there's a long history of allies going through the courses at NSSI out in Colorado in terms of Space 100, 200, and whatever is accessible. But I had the opportunity to go and brief at Johns Hopkins the other day. I was blown away by the level of education that the students there are receiving. And certainly it's already international. I think because of your efforts that there are international officers on those courses, both the West and the Shriva courses there, which I think is fantastic. The biggest issue, I do think, and both of you have mentioned this, and certainly it's something that we saw standing up at Space Command back home, that's the conversation that many of the Space Commanders have, is how do you get the executive legislative branches to understand the criticality of space? As I finished my tour, I said if I could remember them, but there was sort of, I did a top 10, but around about the top 4 was don't underestimate the threat to our joint force from space, don't underestimate the threat to our space forces from space, don't underestimate the criticality of space to life here on Earth. And then the fourth one was space has a PR problem, because why aren't we talking about those first 3 much more of the time? And so that training and education side is not only your individual cadres inside of your services or growing in space commands around the world, but it is that top-down approach so that the senior leaders, the politicians understand this and then maybe have a better budget conversation at the end of the day.
Yeah. I think we heard that this morning too, right? It's educating Congress on not just the threat, but what can we do to combat that threat and making sure that they understand it, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Did you want to add to that, Derek?
one of the powers university partnerships also bring. I talked a lot about, there's different culture and different mindset in doing acquisition. Universities always bring different viewpoints and different ways to look at things. So one of the things that we're doing at SDA with universities, so we have a partnership with Auburn University in Huntsville, War Eagle. You got to say War Eagle every time you say Auburn University. I don't know why. I think it's like throwing salt over your shoulder, but you tell me you have to say it. So Auburn University in Huntsville, we're teamed with them pretty tightly, and they've been helping us to not only have some facility space and some training activities, but they are also building out, as part of their own infrastructure, they're building out a mock ops center to essentially look and feel like our ops centers. University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, which is where our other operations center is, doing something similar on their campus. You say, why is that? What's the advantage for both? From the university's perspective, they want to do it because they want to have that be a training ground so that they can graduate people that really understand how to operate and fly these proliferated systems, and then go in and they can become guardians, or they can go into aerospace and defense and do that. From our perspective, it's a big deal because one of the things that is difficult to do, if you're going to shift the mindset in flying hundreds and hundreds of satellites and do that as autonomous as you can, human factors become part of that. You're no longer going to have, you can no longer rely on operators sitting as a terminal and essentially, I'm flying my satellite. Well, what does that mean? There's no joystick. You're not flying your satellite. What does it mean? And now you're flying 100 satellites with one operator. So the human factors part of that is actually a field of research. And so that's one of the things that we've actually challenged the University of North Dakota and Auburn University to say, hey, look, we want you guys to not only figure out how these op centers work and work with us to develop them, but we want you guys to come up with new ways to actually do it. Because the universities are the ones that are going to come up with that and come up. People that have flown satellites for 10 years aren't going to come in and say, if we completely did this a different way, it would work better. So you need those fresh minds and fresh eyes to look at it to get you that feedback. And so that's one of the ways that we're teamed with universities.
Yeah, that's really great. And again, just another unique way I think that the Space Force is really trying to leverage those partnerships and getting them into those op centers, getting that different perspective. Kristina, I know you recently went out to the National Space Defense Center in Colorado Springs, Schriever. So tell us a little bit about your experience there, getting into that op center. What did you learn there, and how does that inform what you think about the Space Force and what it needs going forward?
I'm looking at General Chess over here. It was a great visit. I did not get to the op center, but we did go in other places, okay, which was great. I think. One, as a career person who cares a lot about threats, it makes my heart happy to see threat analysis and the focus on really understanding what we need to be doing against that as just the baseline for operations. That I think that is not how it has always been. I know a lot of you all know this. I'm happy to see it moving in the right direction here. I'm looking forward to seeing more of that. I think, too, something General Saltzman said earlier that NSDC understands very well is that they are responsible for protecting not just things in space, but they are protecting the entire joint force. And so that is something that everybody said something about that, but we need more understanding from the other services on how important that particular mission is. Because the day without space thing, we all throw that phrasing around, but truly those folks do that on a daily basis to make sure that the joint force is protected from threats in and to, from, in space, all of those things. I think some things that we could do a little bit better, there are still probably policy and bureaucratic hurdles on information sharing. The process of moving information between allies and from this classified program over to this classified program, making sure that the right people have the right information to be able to make decisions. I think that those things are ripe for automation. Those are looking for a technical solution. And the people where I sit and where some of us sit in the Pentagon are the folks that need to get out of the way of those technical solutions from helping actually make the NSDC what it needs to be. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully we have the horse race going, and hopefully the policy people win so that the technology follows and it's all seamless. And knock on wood one more time for that. I want to add to something that Derek said about needing to look at operations maybe a little bit differently. I think that as we continue proliferating, and you have one person with hundreds of satellites, most likely maybe we need to look at the way we apply human capital in a different way. So that the NRO does some of this, and industry does a lot of it. Maybe there's something to be looked at here to put those people who would be I'm an on-console operator. Maybe they can be doing solving some of those harder problems that the organization has, rather than staring at a computer again, when somebody else could potentially, in these I'm going to call them laboratories that you're creating in your partnerships with universities. Maybe we can expand that stuff out. I think that the Space Force has a lot to learn from some of these.
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to watching that play out over the next maybe 5 years.
Yeah.
Just to add to an excellent point on information sharing. That is one of the things clearly. Whether I can solve it or not, I don't think it's probably up to me. I think it's up to other people. But certainly a frustration is seeing the US having done national security space for, well, I think someone said earlier, 72 years, I guess. The classification issue really is a barrier to sharing, where if I take, my personal example of last year, UK Space Command having equivalent of $100 million compared to $30 billion, you've got to make sure you target every single one of those dollars appropriately. And when we come over to the US and try and understand what potentially, there's an industry in the room here, is on the table to be able to buy, yet you can't even have that conversation because it is probably overclassified, I would say, then you've got to go and try and invent these things yourself using those precious dollars and time in your own nations. I think we are starting to get there. We're starting to see the tide turn on this, but it is about getting this at speed. I think you talked about the horse race there. Definitely, we probably need to give a couple of people some faster horses on this one, because right now the allies are cementing their future capability programs with budgets, and we're probably getting to first turn of the handle for allied budgets as well, where they're going in. Certainly in the UK, a defence review, there's political changes all around the world. Now's an opportunity to be able to look for more space money, but again, some of this sits behind the classified wall, and therefore we can't
So I
get
think
to it.
that there is definitely a place for being concerned about security and like real security requirements for things. And I'm not talking about that. We're talking like parochialisms. On the Hill, we have Intel committees, Senate, House, the Armed Service. We all have our different opinions too. So we are part of the problem over on the Hill. And those are the things that we need to work through to be able to enable what you were talking about.
And it is, I don't think any ally, and I do this job for all of the allies out there. Whilst I'm wearing a slightly modified Royal Air Force uniform up here. The allies don't want to know everything, right? Everyone has their own national secrets that you want to protect. This is just about understanding what is enough to be able to, if the title of this is to fuel the future with allies and partners. I think it is that. So incremental steps in order that we can help allies and partners get to where they want to be.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a point you were just making a minute ago, Goddard, and this whole idea of, the challenge of needing to be able to synchronize the planning, right? And a big piece of having, allies and international partners on the staff is to help, kind of inform those decisions. As we said, be able to fill gaps. And I know you're not specifically leading the task force for Futures Command, but in your view, as Futures Command stands up, how do you envision that synchronization? Futures Command is going to have the future force design. How will allies and industry partners, for that matter, play a role in the future force design, and how might that inform, the planning that gets done and the budgeting that gets done internationally, and maybe just from a UK perspective?
From an allied perspective, clearly I've jettisoned the UK.
There you
In fact, from a historical perspective, someone did tell me it was the
Thank you.
it was the anniversary yesterday of the Boston Tea Party. That doesn't appear on the iPhone if you're a Brit. I don't.
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention anything before 1800, but Kristina went there. So
No, exactly.
Lots of history today.
Right.
So it's honestly, it is a huge opportunity. The fact that there is a futures task force led by Major General Dennis Bythewood and his team that have embraced my role, and have brought me and our small team into the conversations there, because I think right from the start they recognised that exactly as CSO said, you're going to have an allied and partner perspective in there from the very beginning. I think one of my previous jobs as the director of the Command Air and Space Operations Centre out in Al Udeid a few years ago, the way that allies and partners are integrated is through liaison officers. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a human capital thing. It's a people thing, because there's always a two-way conversation. The issue we come to from an allied perspective is there are not big space cadres. We've talked about how US Space Force needs to grow. Certainly in the UK, we went from sort of 6 people on the 31st of March 2021 to 600 when I left. But that is still only 600 to do all the jobs that you need to do, from organized training, equip, and operations as well. So the biggest thing is understanding from an allied perspective, where would they best put their precious human capital? You know, is it having a group of allies, liaison officers within Futures? Is it with Doug's team over at Vandenberg as part of S4S on the operations side? You've really got, there's a real balance here, which is why the 3 areas that I talked about, the Shape Futures, Harness CSPO, and Engage NATO, is really a Venn diagram, because I think there is the potential for using a forum like CSPO to provide that sort of virtual liaison officer network, if you like, into. We can share exactly what all of our capability programs are, how we're growing our particular cadres, and it's also a place where the US could share a potential demand signal for the future of, hey, we'd like you to concentrate in this particular area. We've got a gap over here. France, I see you're working on this. Is there any way that we can try and integrate this earlier on? So it's a number of different things. I think the personnel aspect is going to be the key one, and that's where we need to be smart in terms of how we bring all of this together, because you just can't, in every, I'm going to say every small, every big area of the US space enterprise, you can't just put out a demand signal for allied liaisons in, because if the allies jump at every single one, then you'll have the people in the wrong place. So it's about having an overall strategy for how we put futures together.
And managing an allied liaison program is probably a challenge that the S1 is grappling with a bit. Are you guys thinking about that at all, and how that might work?
Yes, and I think part of what the Space Force has to do is think about the same applicability of what you're talking about from an allied perspective, but across the whole service itself, because there is still a lot of organizing internal to the Space Force that needs to happen in order to make those good choices about where to place that precious resource, which is the Guardian, and the collective Guardian I'm talking about. So that's both military and civilian, along with the partnerships that we have on the commercial side. So the ability for us to make informed choices about where we place those precious resources is one of the cards that we hold right now. We've just got to play it well, because that ability to understand where to place people, whether they be key liaison officers or different applicability across the service, is going to be, I think, very critical to the discussion of Space Force growth. For what purpose and for what rationale. And we've got to be very intentional and very clear on why we might need, if we do, and what we're going to do with those resources.
Yeah,
There's definitely a point here as well where we're talking about the size of, like you say, the collective Guardian numbers. Every single allied nation out there is also requesting Guardians, because as you grow your cadres, you want the experts in there, and you want people to be able to talk about what the US is doing as well. And that's difficult, given the jigsaw puzzle that you've got to, you and the S1 team have got to put together because of this precious resource that we've got. So it's a two-way street as well in terms of putting Guardians out into the rest of the world.
It's a double-edged sword to have the demand signal from externals, the service externally asking for more Guardian interaction. And then it takes a while, like we talked about, through education, training, and development, to grow the level of competence that you need in order to be effective in those enterprises. So it's a constant tension between, I need more Guardians, I need them in order to achieve this mission, and then where do you place those precious resources as you do a measured strategy to expand where it makes sense to do so.
Yeah, and while you're also trying to take advantage of this great new opportunity with the Personnel Management Act is allowing to give people the opportunity to go into these part-time roles go experience other things in the world, come back with those experiences. So managing all of that while all of these, immediate demands is a real interesting challenge.
It is that. I would describe it in many ways.
Yeah.
Interesting being just one of them.
Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit, Derek, to the industry partnership. Because here again, Space Development Agency doing new things in new ways. What do you call yourself? The creative disruptor?
Constructive disruptor.
Constructive disruptor. Yes. The constructive disruptor. And of course, industry partners have been a big part of that. Talk a little bit to us about how the industry partnership has really fueled your ability to be a constructive disruptor. How has that back and forth gone? How do you rely on industry to help you, really set this new way of delivering capability?
We give them a contract and they have to deliver. Are you going to deliver, Jim? Or Robert? Sorry. Okay, excellent. No, so let's look at how it looks. So the right way to do this is to create an entire marketplace where there's competition and people all you have a market system that kind of raises itself up, and I think it's working out fairly well. So there's a lot of hiccups at the beginning, and part of the hiccups are everyone fools themselves in how fast they can ramp up production, right? And that happens across the board. I mean, that's happened primarily on a lot of the tier 2 providers. A lot of the subcontractors into the primes aren't able to produce this stuff as quickly as possible. That's kind of growing pains that we'll get through. But the way I look at it is a partnership. And in a partnership, there has to be things that you commit to and that the other partner commits to you. What we've committed to our industry partners is that, look, we're going to compete every tranche, every layer, all the time. Full and open competition, and force a set of standards that you have to demonstrate that you can meet so that you can go forward and produce these things. And we're going to do that on a time scale that's kind of set. You can go out and you can look on our website and you can see when we're going to go forward with our solicitations and approximately how many satellites we're going to buy in each one. And what that means is we communicated to our partners that, look, this is a market that you can assume will be there and have high confidence that it will exist. Don't view this as a set of discrete programs that you win or lose and then that's kind of your business case. View this as a market that you can put a business case together to say, I'm going to win a certain percentage of that market. I'm going to win 20, 30, 10% of that market, whatever. And then base your investments on that. That's our commitment. Now, on the industry side, the commitment is, okay, when you say that you can do something, you have to be able to deliver on that time frame. Yes, we understand there's going to be hiccups along the way, but certainly we do it in such a way that everybody's full and open, eyes wide open. We believe what we're saying is true, and the industry believes what they're saying is true, and we can all move forward. And I think the partnership's working pretty well. If you look at it, we have new vendors on all of our tranches. We have new vendors on tranche 1, and some folks, if you look at our transport vendors from tranche 0 to tranche 1. 2 of the 3 are the same, but I assure you that had we gone with only 2 vendors instead of 3 on tranche 1, not all the vendors would have been the same. We have that rapid competition. On tranche 2, we had new entrants come in, Sierra Space came in, Rocket Labs come in. I continue to see that going forward. We're going to have new folks come on. I hope that the tier 2 providers for a lot of the subcontractors start to build up that marketplace, because right now we're still vendor locked in a few areas there we're trying to get out of. But that's the commitment. I think that's the partnership that we have. That's the partnership we have with industry, and I think that it will continue to work and push forward.
And it's international, right?
It's international. So if you want to look at this, if you look at our optical comm terminals, all of the ones on tranche 0, internationally sourced. On tranche 1, I don't want to do the public math, but the vast majority are international. If you look at our spacecraft buses, a lot of the components of those buses are coming from international partners. We have primarily Europe, but also Canada has a large share of producing in that. We're open to that, and we want our vendors to be, have that be an international market. I want the primes to feel like they can reach out to international suppliers to be able to get components at price and at scale to be able to build that up. We don't have anything in any of our contracts that we put out that says, you know, it has to be U.S. only. There's only one point that I have raised in the past, and that is there are two threats that we're worried about. And if you're proliferating, you can proliferate yourself out of 1v1 threats pretty easily. But common mode failures, you can't. And so cyber is obviously a big common mode failure that we worry a lot about. We put a lot of controls in place. And supply chain interdiction is another one, especially if we're trying to buy commercial commoditized components. A lot of times you may not have a good understanding of the provenance of your part, so you have to be able to do inspections on that. Where those two intersect are where I really get scared. So that the only time that I have had kind of a heavy hand in international partners is flight software written overseas is very difficult for me to accept at large, because it's coming in and it's, well, I've got the supply chain and the cyber problem all combined into one, and those are both my two main threat vectors. So that's the only area where I say, okay, I want to have some extra controls in there to make sure I can validate the provenance of any code coming in that's going to be critical on a spacecraft. But beyond that, we're open. We'll validate, we'll do subcomponent validation to make sure that what we buy is what we get, and we want our parts to be internationally sourced.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up, because there really is a very vast industrial base that we can take advantage of. We want to find the best capabilities that are out there to bring forward, bearing in mind that there are certainly those concerns from a cyber perspective and from a supply chain perspective. Are there any regulatory challenges or any other areas where you might look to Congress to help you move faster and really leverage the defense industrial base here in the U.S. or internationally more effectively?
Well, Kristina already mentioned one problem we've had, and that is with our friends at the FAA. God bless them. So there is typically, and this is all licensing, all spectrum. Typically, if you're changing the model to where now you're not launching a constellation once every 10 years. You're launching every other year, and eventually that will be running to where you're essentially continually launching new capabilities. You're going to push the limit on what the system was designed to be able to support when that system was designed to support a new capability every 10 years. And we've essentially reached that point and broken it when it comes to Link 16 from space. So Link 16 from space is a new concept, right? It's never been done before. It's a concept that the FAA has been working with us, but they have been pushing back because there's concerns that safety of flight for commercial airlines, which obviously the FAA should take very seriously. Because of that, though, if you look at it, all of our testing has been done outside of the national airspace, either with our partners in Australia, partners with Norway, or over the open ocean in the Pacific. And that has worked just fine, except for the fact that all of our test teams are located in the U.S. Primarily, most of them are located at Eglin Test Range down in Florida. So for them, it is very taxing to have them deploy for months at a time to do these tests, and that slows down our tests, increases the cost of tests, and ultimately will delay fielding of the operational capabilities to get through tests. So that is one of the regulatory areas that doesn't just affect the Space Development Agency, that affects the Department of Defense as a whole, working with FAA to get these new rules and new things in place. There's got to be a way where we can work out ways to get testing authorities to be able to do things more quickly. And Link 16 is the one that's the top of my mind, but anything that has to do with RF spectrum management is antiquated compared to this new method of fielding things at a rapid pace.
Yeah. Kristina, are there any other areas of public-private partnership and the role Congress can play to help influence that, drive that for the betterment of the Space Force and the space enterprise in general?
I think that there's a couple thoughts I have on this that maybe aren't a direct answer to that question per se. But one, I am hopeful that the next administration, next Congress will raise the budget for the Space Force, given everybody's increased understanding of how important all of what we've been talking about is to the joint fight and to keeping all of our allies safe. In lieu of that, if we do have budget constraints, I think we're gonna have to make sure that we can leverage our commercial and allied partners as much as possible. If we don't have the money to do something, maybe some of our allies do. If we don't have the money to do something, maybe we can contract it out in a smart way that is cyber secure. I think that those things are, I can't really speak to a lot of the spectrum stuff because that's not really armed service. There's a lot of cross-committee jurisdiction issues there that are ongoing, and I definitely can't really speak to at the moment. But I think that you're going to see us on the Hill wrestling with a lot of those issues in the coming couple of years. But my boss, Senator Wicker, has been on the record multiple times saying top line increase at a minimum because it's important. And it's not, I think it was General Saltzman saying, it's not top line for top line, it's top line for application of power in the correct places to increase the lethality of the joint force. And I think that hopefully, I am hopeful for that in the next Congress, next administration.
So you were speaking for Senator Wicker then?
I was not. I was giving him a shout out. I was giving him a shout out.
Just one point on that, ITAR. We haven't talked about ITAR, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but just suffice to say, there is a waiver that you can apply for. I think the frustration an awful lot of the time is how long that takes, is the length of process required in order to get a waiver and then continue the sort of export side of things. And
yeah, now I will say, anytime anyone points out you can waiver anything, but if you're in industry and you're going to bid, you're going to bid something for the government to buy, if in your bid you say, in order for you to accept this bid as priced, you have to give us a waiver, most of the folks in industry would not sign off on that bid going in. They would say, let's get another supplier. So any time, the industry is going to take the position of, we don't want to make our customer do something that they didn't say they were going to do from the beginning, so we won't bid it. So we've got to be careful there.
yeah.
Yeah. I want to get a couple of these questions from the audience here, and this kind of builds upon what we were chatting about a little bit, takes us into a different sort of partnership that's really important to the Space Force, and that's with the intelligence community. And the question is, and maybe Derek, we'll stick with you and get your thoughts here, how can we solve the problem of blurred lines between NRO, NGA, and the Space Force on buying commercial space capabilities? Do you have a perspective on that from what you do?
I do have a perspective.
Share
Next
that
question.
with us.
No, so look, there's a couple. It's a loaded question, but I'll answer it this way. So there's a couple different ways you can buy commercial products and commercial services and things, and the aspect of buying commercial directly as a service, and whether or not that's the NRO's job, NGA's job, Space Force job. I know for one that's not SDA's job. So I just punt on that, because SDA uses commercial in a different means. So there's a lot of different ways, and the way that we employ commercial is we buy parts and components and satellites that have been developed for the commercial market, but tweaked in a way that now they can do a DoD mission. So that's the way when we utilize commercial aspects of it, that's what we do. And that's SDA's job, and that's kind of what we focus on, is that kind of area of the commercial divide. As far as the other side, that's other people to discuss.
Just from an international point, certainly that was something that sometimes gets confusing, when you look in from abroad and who owns what, who does what. So there's an education side of it there. But certainly in my role, I include in the partnership side the intelligence community as well. And certainly I'm liaising with a couple of those organizations, not to try and drive them in a particular direction, but just trying to understand their international partnerships, what their strategies are, and so on, so that you can better inform allies and partners of how it actually works over here. And I think that there's a education side that sits there initially, but then, if we are all talking in terms of strategies, then that can only be a good thing in terms of coherency.
Absolutely.
I think one of the primary use cases for buying commercial information is for sharing with allies. And I think that and without committing to any one of the organizations that you listed, I think that anybody that is in a position to better do that to support the warfighter should be involved in those conversations.
Yeah, and just on the commercial side of things, I do have to shout out the JCO, the Joint Commercial Operation, which I think has just been amazing for allies and partners, where you just commit people to it, and the US has done an amazing thing here in bringing people together that ultimately has resulted in a 24 hours worth of people looking at commercial data, understanding it, and putting out notice to space operators, which, when we talk about the classified conversation as well, has put stuff out in the open that we would have never have talked about before. When the UK became a member of JCO, I would get a cold sweat as I stood up at a podium to give a speech talking about the various things in there, knowing that just a few weeks previously these were highly classified.
Yeah.
And so in that particular case, the use of commercial space data to understand what is going on in the domain, given that SDA underpins everything that we do, I think has just been has been fantastic.
Yeah, so there's certainly been a lot of collaboration there. So we're getting close to an end here, but Kate, I wanted to come back to a point that you made earlier, which is this lack of really clear understanding yet on the part of the public, right, about what the Space Force is, what the role of the Space Force is, you know, and it certainly can impact recruiting and retention from your standpoint. What do you think the Space Force can do to better tell its story, to better get its message across? And I want to open that up to others on the panel as well, but we'll start with you from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we are very aware of what the data is telling us about public awareness about the Space Force. Generally speaking, if you look at that data, less than 8% even know it exists, and a smaller subset of the national population can describe what we do. And there's a conflation, of course, between what, if you have heard of Space Command and Space Force, so we're very aware of that. What it is not translated into, however, is a recruiting problem or a retention problem.
Oh, good.
So that's all goodness, but I'm a realist, and we've talked a lot about numbers and growth, and part of our advantage right now is we've got the new thing advantage. We've got small numbers. And so I think those are allowing us to offset what could be an otherwise deleterious effect of that data. But what I think is very exciting is that the Space Force, in its separate budget now, actually has an ability to put some dollars towards this through a marketing and branding campaign. We have some pretty exciting shows that we're developing, both VR, digital technology, as well as things like planetariums and educational components, to start exporting out the message of not just what the Space Force is, but how it connects with your day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to continue to just do more of that as we continue to grow the enterprise and grow our ability to communicate more externally. It's certainly not lost on the Space Force how much of the last 5 years has been about, to use the earlier analogy from this morning, getting the tree stood up, right? Before you start putting the ornaments on. We're at a point now where we can start communicating more publicly and more deliberately, and I think we're trying to continue to make that a more deliberate approach as we go forward.
Yeah.
I think something that would be helpful too, I think a couple years ago there was this idea of an ideal guardian, and I think that those terms have been passed by, and that's fine. But I do think that the public knows what a soldier is. The public knows a Marine. I don't think the public knows what is a guardian, and I think that that's a big opportunity for the Space Force over the next few years to really figure that out, define it, and show it to the American public.
Yep, I agree completely. I think that's exactly what we're talking about with getting the message out and describing what it is we do, so that somebody can equate a term like soldier to what is done, equate the term like guardian to the mission, and I think we've got to connect those two for sure.
Yeah.
Certainly from my perspective, I think we have to broaden the audience. Kate and I were talking actually from an air perspective, from an army perspective. I've never seen so many conferences in space, but everyone is pretty much the same You know, I've
Yep.
met most of you
Talking to each
in this
other.
room, you know, at least once already. We're talking to each other. In this particular role, I haven't been invited to an Army, a Navy, a Marine conference to talk about space. And then from a public perspective, I mentioned, you know, number 4 on my list was space has a PR problem. I kind of said it in jest once, but I do believe this, that, you know, if you get the climate change or pollution in the oceans, the public consciousness comes from, in our case in the UK, a national treasure like Sir David Attenborough narrating something. You know, I know President Obama narrated a thing on the oceans just the other day. That's the thing that gets in there. And we have stuff about cosmos, those sorts of things. We don't have these sorts of TV shows that gets the public on board to understand the criticality and the fragility of the domain. I understand its importance to the way that we live down here on Earth. Understand its importance to the way defense works. It is just not out there yet.
Yeah.
You know, every audience I speak to that doesn't have a space background just doesn't understand most of the time.
Yeah, Netflix notwithstanding.
Yes.
I do remember when that series first came out, General Raymond might have stepped out, but we actually saw it as a benefit because it was like a huge distractor, right? Everybody was paying attention to that so that we could get, you know, focused
Real
on
work done.
getting the tree up, right? And doing it very, very
Just a
quickly.
very quick story on that. When I got the UK Space Command job, the Air Force tweeted it, I retweeted it and said, hey, you know, honoured to get the job, have been watching Space Force on Netflix for tips. The very next day, it appeared as like the first scroll on the Daily Mail online, this massive 48 font headline
Yeah.
that said, new Space Commander announced, says he's watching Netflix for tips. So I stopped tweeting after that.
Yeah. It gets a little scary, right? But unfortunately, that series didn't last, and now we're at a stage where we do need, to your point, Goddard, those more serious, you know, perspectives and ways to understand, you know, what the Space Force does, how it connects to everyday life, and having that way to share that with the public. I love the idea of the planetarium and the other kinds of, you know, leveraging technology through AR, VR to bring the public in, right, and to help families, right, and just everyday people understand how important space is to their everyday way of life, and then what the Space Force and U.S. Space Command and others around the world are doing to contribute to that. Derek, your thoughts on how the message can get out?
No, I mean, what was said here was great. We try to get our message out on that we're trying to do things differently to get new people in and entrance. As I was sitting here, I just had the thought, yeah, what you need the splash screen every time you start up your phone to say, you know, timing and positioning brought to you by the United States Space Force. You're welcome, but I don't know what else to do.
I think that's a great idea. Absolutely. Well, we're at the end of time, so thank you all for being a part of this panel. I think this diverse set of perspectives on how you view moving forward, fueling the force with people and partnerships, all the partnerships that are so important, the international partnerships, the industry partnerships, congressional partnerships, partnerships with the public domain, so valuable and so critical to the ability for us to continue to grow the Space Force and continue to drive the mission. Thank you for what you do every day. Thank you for being on the panel with us today. Please join me in.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eric.